Jan Johnson es una pionera en la estrategia y diseño de entornos laborales, con una impresionante carrera que abarca más de 3 décadas. Con títulos de Purdue e Indiana University, ha trabajado en diversas empresas líderes del sector como Perkins Will, HOK y Allsteel, donde desarrolló innovadoras estrategias de trabajo remoto y lideró investigaciones sobre la productividad en el lugar del trabajo. Jan es reconocida oradora, ha influido significativamente en la profesión, enseñando en el programa MCR de Cornell Global y actualizando competencias clave en respuesta a la pandemia. Su liderazgo y visión la han convertido en una figura galardonada en el mundo del diseño de interiores. Please welcome Jan to this forum.
Buenos días. Forgive me for only speaking English, I apologize. But gracias, estoy contenta por estar en México con ustedes. So I want to talk a bit about what I think is both great and opportunity for change in the way we think about the workplace. I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been spending my whole career thinking about this, and I want to share some ideas about where we can make changes and improve things even more than we already have. The pandemic clearly disrupted many things, but with every kind of disruption comes opportunity. And we have the opportunity to really think about what else we could be doing to help organizations be more successful, to help workers thrive, to help work be done more effectively, to help people be more satisfied with their roles and their responsibilities. So I want to talk about what we could be doing differently. And where I want to start is by telling you a little bit about what I want to cover, but I'm going to do it very quickly. My first point is I think there's room for improvement. What we've been doing certainly has been working, clearly. Organizations have been very successful in the past, but there's room for more. There's room for better, and that's what I want to talk about. The idea around why we have failed to improve them, I think, is because we tended to take it for granted. When most organizations were behaving in much the same way and workplaces were designed with many of the same ideas, that sort of told us all that we were mostly doing the right things. But I think what was lacking was intentionality. How do we get more deliberate? How do we get more purposeful? How can we involve the workers themselves in the process of designing and using the workplace so that we can tap into all that they know about how things could be better? And then I want to talk about what other additional perspectives or practices or ideas or research we could bring to this that would help inform what I was just saying. And finally, what could we do differently to make some of those new ideas and those new practices stick? And then what are some of the other things that this could mean for workplace design? So I'm going to try to cover that rather quickly this afternoon, and I appreciate your patience. So first I want to talk about something that I think is not good for us. Mandates, return to office mandates. I don't know how prevalent that is here, but I can tell you in the US there's a tremendous amount of disagreement about whether they're good or bad. I come down on thinking that they're bad because they're simple, they're too simplistic. They don't cover the nuance and the variety of what organizations do and the incredible differentiation between different types of teams doing different sorts of roles inside the organization. So the things I have on the slide, the 3 bullets, are what I believe to be some of the ideas that leaders have in their heads about why mandates are important. Why is it important for people to be present? And I think it's because they believe that they have to be supervised, that workers must be watched, which I think is a terrible statement. The second is that culture comes from its leaders. And that's actually not necessarily true. Culture comes from everyone in the organization sort of agreeing to how it is they will do the right things and what it is that they should avoid doing. Those unwritten rules, which I'll talk about in a little bit, are the things that we collectively agree to in the organization, not necessarily just what the leaders believe is appropriate. And then finally, this notion that we have to be in person for innovation to take place. And again, we know better than that. There's lots of ways in which the office helps that. There's no question it helps set the stage for the kinds of things that would make innovation easier. Just seeing each other, being around each other, watching each other's body language, having a chance to run into people. Of course, those are all good, but we could be even more intentional about how we get together, when we get together, what we do, and which things are important for us to make sure we're doing in each other's presence. And this is my point, is that presence is not equivalent to productivity. Getting people together does not magically cause things to happen. It's not a lightning strike. It needs to be thoughtful, intentional, purposeful, and meaningful. So here's some backup for what I was just talking about. Brian Elliott is a well-known workplace person in the States. He's written several articles for MIT Sloan, which is a business magazine from MIT University in Cambridge. And his point is, monitoring is the lowest form of management. And so to use mandates as a way to watch people, to supervise visually, it's just almost disrespectful, because it makes them feel as though they're not trusted and they can't do the things that they need to do successfully. So the other thing we're finding out, and Brian was one of the people that gave us some of this information, and there have been other research pieces that have been done in the US about the unintended consequences of these mandates. One is that there's been a tremendous amount of people leave the organizations who have created those mandates. Microsoft lost 5% of its high performers. Apple declined 4%. SpaceX, Elon Musk's aerospace company, who does do full-time in-office, dropped 15% of their high performers after mandates were put in place. This is a bad idea. It has unintended consequences that are not great for our organizations. And in addition, it's tougher on females, who often have caregiving responsibilities, to feel as though they have to obey the 9 to 5, 5 days a week mantra. And millennials, the latest generation, Generation X, also push back against what seems to them to be arbitrary. So in contrast to that, there's also some fantastic research around what autonomy does for organizations. Those organizations who give their people greater control over where, when, and how they work. And these are the stats. Those organizations who do this, who provide more autonomy to their workers about where, when, and how they work, typically have a higher percentage of high performers inside their organizations to begin with, because they draw people who want to be respected for their capabilities. The second statistic is that those high performers tend to also stay within the organization longer than a lot of their peers who are not high performers. And finally, the organizations who have that sort of approach to autonomy for their workers tend to be 2 to 4 times as financially successful as those organizations who micromanage. Clearly, even though I know it feels risky to give workers more of that autonomy, it's a great strategy that really benefits organizations tremendously. Now, the other reason I don't like mandates is that there's, again, no nuance, no detail around who we're talking about and how they work. And so I'm a poor graphic designer, so forgive this chart, but basically what it is a matrix. And on the vertical axis, where you see things like solo heads down and specialized equipment and materials, those are all perhaps pieces of someone's job, things they do throughout their work. And the horizontal axis, which is where work takes place, is intending to say that there's sometimes synergy between those two ideas, that those people whose job is such that they're individual contributors who spend a lot of time doing individual work in a focused setting, heads down, of course they're good remote employees. They may not be full-time, but at least there's a correlation there to take advantage of. The opposite is true with the second row of specialized equipment and materials. There's clearly situations where people work with equipment that's only available in the workplace. So of course they have to be there most of the time. But that doesn't mean they have to be there all of the time. Aren't there ways for us to design some amount of flexibility into their roles as well? And then finally, the other two circles where you see on social connection and in this notion of ideation, collaboration, and development is this idea that there are those kinds of activities, socializing and doing very complex, collaborative, collective, negotiated sorts of problem-solving, very complicated things are better in person. We can read each other's body language, we can pick up on cues, we can have sidebars with people to go over what we just talked about, to have negotiations between different factions in the room that want to make a case for a different perspective. Those things happen really, really well in person. So where I'm going to go with this in a couple slides is to talk about team agreements. How can we begin to try to encourage teams to work out in advance how they're going to meet their objectives, how they're going to work, when do they need the office, which types of these activities are best done in person, and what are their etiquettes around things like how the team chooses to respond to each other. Is there a rule that, you know, if somebody sends you an email, you need to respond yet that day? Are there times when we agree that we're going to be off and not available so that we can get our own work done? Are there times when we definitely make ourselves available to others? Are there certain types of ways we use technology? All those things that would help us as designers and architects to know more about then what the office needs to do, rather than guessing, or rather than kind of coming up with a one-size-fits-all strategy and hoping for the best. So there's opportunity for us to learn that much more, and in the act of doing that, engage the workers and have them tell us, because they are the experts in how they get their work done. They know what they're doing. They know how to get their jobs done. We need that information so that we can make sure that the workplace supports the things that they need to do. And that asking them to do that also lets them feel seen and heard. Also lets them have some input into the things that we, perhaps as their designer or their architect, can choose to shape. So there's an opportunity for us to use that sort of form of engagement, plus some others I'm going to talk about, to try to get them to be more engaged and involved, to feel as though they belong, to feel as though they're heard and seen, to understand the direction that we might be recommending in terms of some design changes, for example, and that they've contributed to that process and are therefore, it's also a form of change management because they were part of the development of the ideas that we're now going to implement. So forgive all the words on the slide, but this is what I think we could be doing better at. I think the more we understand cultural norms, the good ones and the bad ones, and we learn how to get better at psychological safety, which is a huge backbone of everyone being able to learn, to contribute, to even challenge, they feel a greater sense of belonging and connection to the organization, which keeps them around longer. There's also just what I said about team agreements, for example, of understanding how work is actually happening so that we know how to design better interiors. And finally, this idea of quality experiences, autonomy, and involvement. The things I was just mentioning are so powerful. Along with that is this idea of experimentation, and the latest information from Gensler also backs this up and talks about how important experimentation is because things are in flux. We've been disrupted. Lots of things are changing. Lots of organizations still have not figured out exactly what they want to do. Experimentation lets us try things, lets us test, lets us refine things as we learn what works and what doesn't. And again, another form of engagement with our workers about their input and their insights into what's working and what isn't. And then from that, we get worker engagement that's authentic, that feels good, that makes them feel more a part of the organization and engaged in the process. We have teams that, because they now understand a little bit better how to be explicit about the way their teams operate, can be just that much more accountable to each other and clear on how they intend to go forward. That self-awareness is incredibly important. And finally, one of the last things I'm going to talk about is evolving spaces. How can we make sure that we now design for change? And I'll give you an example. GSK, a pharmaceutical company in the States, tends to hold some percentage of the overall project budget so that they can continue to make changes for 2 more years. They spend 75% of the budget to do the initial fit out, but then they hold other monies so that if they didn't get it right, or some of our best guesses didn't work out the way we wanted them to, they can still make those changes and make it better and do that experimentation. I think that's a brilliant idea that we should all think a little bit about. Because when we, say, take a new lease and we build it out for 7, 10 years, that's a long time to go without being able to keep up with the way the business is evolving. The space should evolve with the business. The space should evolve at the speed of the business changing. And so designing in ways in which that can be done easily and cheaply is one of the things that we also advocate for. Now, having said that I'm not a big fan of mandates, there are really still very good reasons why we need to be together. These slides came from a good colleague of mine who did a lot of research on this, and one of the points he makes is that it takes being in the same place with somebody else face-to-face, that socialization thing I talked about earlier, to really build relationships. And you can see here from the symbols that are used in this chart that face-to-face is the quickest way to establish greater trust between people. And text is the worst. You almost never get there using texts. So all you really young people, pay attention. This is really important. It's a way for us, again, to build social cohesion amongst teams, to get to know our colleagues, again, a sense of belonging, et cetera, et cetera. The second reason is the importance of that trust. Trust makes a huge difference in the organization's effectiveness. And if leaders, I think we all sort of know this intuitively, but we're giving you some data to support it so that leaders can take it into consideration and maybe make some bigger investments in this idea. The second reason we need to be there together is to build empathy. And this is, notice the one comment around sixth graders in the middle on the bottom. It talks about when they stepped away from social media for what is it, 5 days, just 5 days without a bunch of social media. They were better at reading other people's facial expressions and emotions. This is a good thing for us to be better at understanding how to read each other, how to talk to each other, how to get to know what each other thinks and how we operate and what our basic values are and all those sorts of things. This is what builds tight communities. This is what builds good social cohesion. And the next one, which I hadn't thought about when my colleague first showed me this slide, was to experience diversity. If we are staying home a lot, we're not exposing ourselves to lots of different points of view, to lots of different people with very different values or very different habits or very different ways of looking at the world. It's really important for us to be exposed to those things and to accept them and to learn how to work with people who do not think the same way we do. This is how innovation happens. If we all think the exact same way about the exact same thing, that is the opposite of innovation. We have to keep our minds open, and we learn how to keep our minds open by being around other people. Come on. And then the last slide in this kind of collection here is this idea of strengthening strengthening psychological safety. And this gives us our sense of belonging. And if you see the chart on the right, this is one of my favorite charts from a fantastic book. I think we're going to be able to get you this deck after the show so you can pick up all the references that are in here and some things that I've also put at the back. But basically, he talks about different stages of sense of belonging. First, it's just feeling like you've been included, that people know who you are, that you're welcome to be where you're at. But then we learn that it's okay to ask for more professional development or to gain more knowledge with other people's help. And then we learn we can contribute and be respected for that contribution. And finally, we learn that we can actually challenge people. It's okay to push back. It's okay to have a discussion about different points of view, and that those things lead up to a sense of safety. And those kinds of situations create opportunities for us to perform better, to feel a greater sense of commitment to the organization, to feel that we want to work harder because we feel like it's going to be respected and appreciated. And that same author talks about how devastating it is when this is wrong. And I love the last bit, that organizations that lack psychological safety are galloping their way to extinction. Now, Gartner, I don't know if you've heard of them. They're a technology consulting company in the US. I'm assuming they're probably global. But even they've gotten on this bandwagon and now are thinking about changing our focus as organizations from thinking about the bricks and mortar being the key to the whole thing to thinking about the humans in the space being the key to the whole thing. which would seem obvious now that you think about it. And that's the point, is we should be thinking about those interpersonal relationships, that culture, those things that are about some of the things we just talked about in terms of why it's important for us to be together. Some of those design principles and in action, I want to talk a little bit more about autonomy and choice, which I've sort of already mentioned, but this idea around the patterns of presence are also going to shift if we give people more autonomy. We won't be guaranteed that everyone's always in. We won't know exactly what the ebb and flow in the space is. And so that makes a lot of organizations nervous, and I think mandates are potentially a knee-jerk reaction to that. They'd like to see it be stable when it doesn't really need to be. The second one is back what I was saying about uncertainty and experimentation. I think it's super important that we allow that or even embrace it and celebrate it. And finally, the idea of with autonomy, which is, as I've said, a good thing, comes responsibility. So when we give people more autonomy, we're also giving them more responsibility and obligation to each other. I can't ghost my colleagues. I can't disappear and not be there to do what I need to do for my team, even though I have choice in how and when and how, when I work, for example. But now I have obligations that must be met. And on the spatial side, I think the mix of spaces in the office is changing. You've all probably seen evidence of that, right? So how do we figure out what that mix should be? And part of it comes from learning what we can learn from the conversations with teams and how they intend to use the office and in what ways and sort of in what volumes, for example. And how we may be able to get better data on a real-time basis so that we can see what's actually happening over time and how the patterns are forming and where the spikes are and all those sorts of things, so that we can do a better job of balancing individual spaces and spaces to collaborate and spaces to socialize. And then the idea of identity. A lot of organizations are playing with free address or some other form of that, or desk sharing in some ways. But if we have, again, strong encouragement to teams to take more sense of responsibility over their neighborhoods, now we're giving them a different way to think about identity. Now the identity is the group, which I think is a strong perspective. And then this idea, again, of continuous improvement, designing for change, that those are the things that we should be better at as best we can get there. Now, forgive me for all the words on this slide, but this is some research that my old organization sponsored some years ago, looking at all the science and the studies that had been done about what it is that affects worker productivity. And so the things in the bright green box have to do with the way organizations manage and or how those interpersonal relationships within the organizations work. And you can see this kind of a complicated graphic, I apologize for that, but the top horizontal line is team factors, things that are known to benefit the performance of teams. The middle one is teams and individual factors, and the bottom one is just individual factors. But we're also juxtaposing the way in which the organization manages and the ways in which individual workers treat each other. The middle piece is those things related to the physical space, the environmental space. And finally, the blue box at the end are those things that affect the way we perform as bodies, as humans, our brains. How well are we, in sleep and in mental health and in memory and whether I'm staying hydrated and all the sorts of things that help me to just be a better, more productive person, more effective at what I do. Those things, let me actually go back for a sec. If I can get this to work. Okay. The 6 in the upper left-hand corner, social cohesion, perceived supervisory support, information sharing, vision and goal clarity, external outreach, meaning keeping your mental models open to inside or outside information, and trust are the top 6 that have the most correlation to team productivity. Social cohesion, the first on that list, is the highest of those. It's like 10 times more powerful than the other 5. But the other 5 are equally important. And this is the sort of thing, again, that team agreements and other sorts of ways in which we might engage workers or teams of workers within our organizations, we can help speed up their effectiveness by trying to also help nurture that formation of social cohesion. That is a good goal. So now I want to talk too about other sorts of ways in which we can inform or can engage workers, not just about team agreements. It's on this list, but I want to talk a little bit about unwritten rules. So if you've not heard that term before, it's basically synonymous with social norms, how the organization conducts itself. And it's a way of understanding what's sanctioned and what's not sanctioned. And so just understanding where the organization has really good norms and where they have some dysfunctional norms is something for us to maybe ferret out and see if we can help improve. Those productivity metrics I had on the previous slide are also good things we can use as ways to measure how we're doing. And finally, things like annual scorecards and site councils can also be a huge benefit in understanding how the organization is doing in its own ways of looking at itself. How can we kind of keep an eye on what we're up to? So I think I'm running out of time here, but I'm gonna at least very quickly tell you what else is in this deck. And as I said, I believe we're gonna be able to make it available to you. When we talk about those unwritten rules, there's things that affect the way in which we manage, and there's things that affect the way in which we design. And they're true across the board. So we'll make sure you have ways to understand where this information is coming from. And I just wanted to quickly flash up this idea of where social cohesion, what benefits it has. So all the things on the right is what social cohesion leads to. So I think I've run out of time, but I wanted to just again say there's lots of things we can do from a behavioral perspective. There's lots of things we can do by engaging the folks inside our organizations and really thinking about how much diversity is in our own organizations and how we may want to design different sorts of spaces and different sorts of management techniques and all that sort of thing to make all that work. So thank you for your attention and enjoy the rest of the Congress.
Jan, thank you very much for being with us. And le pido a Mark Bauer que nos acompañe en el escenario para entregar el reconocimiento y hacer las fotografías. Thank you.